Hi all. Let's continue with the files part. So, so far in the previous video, we have seen how to open the file and how to ensure that, we have opened the file correctly without any errors. So that part is done. Now let's see how to read the contents from the file. So we are done with these two steps. What's the package that we have to import, and how do we create the file object or file variable, open it and check the errors and all. Now the third step, reading input values from file. So let's say I have this text file with numbers like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I only have 5 numbers spread across 5 lines. Okay. So this is like treat it like a big parcel from Amazon with 5 items: item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, and item 5. Now that you ensure that all the items are not damaged, the product is not damaged, you are opening it and you are retrieving one item after the other. So how long do we retrieve these items? As long as there are items in the parcel, we retrieve them. In the same manner, in the same manner, as long as there's data to be read from the file, we read the data. We read the data. So when we do this, ifile dot open and give the input.txt. If the file is not damaged, if the product is not damaged, if we got the, if we opened the file correctly, this I file, this would be pointing to the first line in the file. So we are at the first line in the file and we have to go line after line till we reach the end of the file. Till we reach end of the file, we have to keep on going. So how do we know it's end of the file? So at this point, to know the end of file, there is another function called is EOF, or I think it's just EOF. Let me confirm. Yeah, it's not is EOF. It's simply EOF. So ifile dot EOF. So again, this is a flag. If we are at the end of the file, this becomes true. That means we are done retrieving all the items from the parcel. If not, if we have still some more items in the parcel to retrieve or to keep out or to move out or to take out, so then it will be false. So what we'll do is, we don't know how many parcels are there. Let's assume that. So the best loop to use when you don't know the number of times you have to iterate is while, because for loop we generally limit. If we know the limit, we prefer for loops, but if we don't know the limit, we prefer while loop. And the way we write while condition is that, remember, ifile.eof, once we are at the end of the file, this is true. But if we are reading data like this, like this, like this, these are still not end of files. That means there is some data. So at all these points, end of file will be false. End of file will be false. Only here it will be true. So what we'll do is, as long as it is false, we are adding a not gate or not operator to make it true. So as long as there is valid data, as long as we have items in the parcel, or as long as we reach the end of file, we keep on reading data. So let's say I'm creating an integer int num and I'm initializing it with 0. So if I do something like this, ifile num, that means I'm reading the first number. So let's say this is the computer's memory. Somewhere here we have num, and num is going to be 1. and I'm not doing anything in this while loop. So uh, now this pointer, now this pointer I file will be pointing to the second line. So it goes here. Is it not end of file? Because I'm still at the second line. I have to reach like 5 lines to reach end of line. I'm still at the second line. So again, it comes here. It gives whatever data is there on that particular line into number. So num is going to be 2. Right after that, I file will move to next line. It reads the next value, which is 3. And then again, it moves to the next line, and so on. And whatever the value that we are reading into num, that keeps on updating. And eventually, once we are done reading the 5th line, that means we are at the end of the file. At the end of the file, this is going to be true. Okay, sometimes this doesn't work as expected. Yeah. At the end of file, this is going to be true. Not of true is going to be false, and eventually will come out of the while loop. So this is how we write a while loop to keep on reading data one line after the other or one value after the other from a file. Now, what we are going to do with this data is secondary, but this is the primary job of reading the data. Okay. Now, let's see some more scenarios. Like, let's say you are creating an integer called num. So that means num can hold only integer types. But if your input.txt, if your input.txt, if it contains values like this, 1, 2, a, 3, 4, 5. So at the beginning, I file, it'll always point to line 1. So while I file not of end of file. So while it's not end of file, it's still there's some data. We can do something like this. I file num, but all these are compatible types. But the one that's not compatible, this is not compatible with an integer because we are expecting numbers, but there's a character in the file. So to handle these scenarios, what we will do is like how we handle cin.fail, we simply do ifile.fail. If it's a failure, we don't want to do anything with it. We basically want to clear the failure, ignore that particular line or whatever the characters are there on the line and proceed further. That's what we are basically doing. So like how we do with scene, the same. If I don't want to read incompatible type, all I'm going to do is to create a trap. If it's a failure, it's a trap. Clear the trap, ignore the input. So that's what we have to do. And now let's see how we meaningfully utilize this. So now let's say I have 1, 2, a, 3, 4, and 5. So now I want to find sum of all these numbers. Now I want to find sum of all these numbers, and I don't want a because it's a character, it's not an integer. So the way I do is this. Outside the while loop, I'll create a variable to keep track of sum. And at the beginning, I file is pointing here. Okay, and it's not end of file. And also to store the intermittent data, I create another variable called num. So the way I write is while it's not end of file, keep on reading the data. And the way we read data, simply do I file into the temporary variable that we have. And right after reading the data, always ensure that you're checking for the failure trap. So I file dot fail, and then you do I file dot clear, and then you do I file dot ignore, and so on. Now, this part is done. If it's a failure, we are capturing it. If it's a failure, we are capturing it. What if it's not a failure? If it's not a failure, that means you have read valid data. Then you have to add it to the sum. So you have to add it to the sum so that you get sum of all the valid data inside a file. So this is how you do it. This is how you utilize the data in a file to do this. And one last scenario, and this scenario will be helpful for your lab 5B. Now, what if there are two columns in the input file? 1, 2, A, B, these are invalid, 3, 4, and 5, 6. What if there are two values? How do I read it? So always remember, I file will be pointing to this line at the beginning, and this is the end of file. Okay, so I'll show you, since now I have two values or two integers in one line. I'll create two variables. Num is 0, num2 is also 0. So num1 and num2, num1 will hold the first column, num2 will hold the second column data. So the way I write is, always get familiarized with this while loop. While it's not I file dot end of file, while it's not end of file. So remember, if I have two variables, int a comma b, and if I want to read both the values simultaneously, we do something like this: read a comma b. In the same way, if I do I file num1 and then num2, this means we are creating two variables, num1, num2. On the first line, whatever the first value is there, it goes into num1. And whatever the second value is there, it goes into num2. So always remember, as soon as we read the data, the first thing, before using the data, the first thing we have to do is it an input failure? Sorry. Is it an input failure? Yeah, my bad. I was muted for a second. So now you know what to do on input failure, handle it. And now, what if it's not a failure? If it's not a failure, maybe you want to print out the sum of num1 and num2. So num1 plus num2 is equal to num1 plus num2. That's it. And eventually close the while. So in this manner, you can keep on moving the I file to the next line, to the next line, to the next line until you reach the end of file. Eventually, the while loop breaks out. So this is how we deal with files. If the file has a single column, if the file has two columns, like that. So I hope these two tutorial videos are a bit helpful and be of some assistance while doing Lab 5B. If not, please always reach out to me on Discord or emails, and I'll be there to help you guys. Thank you all.